The United States says it controls the Strait of Hormuz 100%. Iran says the strait will not reopen until America surrenders its demands in full. Both statements were made in the same week. Both cannot be completely true, and yet right now both are shaping the global oil market at the same time. That is the paradox at the center of today's story. A superpower claiming total control over a waterway it cannot actually move a tanker through without a fight. Here is where things stand this week. The Strait of Hormuz, the 20-mile-wide channel that has carried roughly a fifth of the world's oil and gas for decades, is once again a battlefield of words, warships, and economic warfare. And the two sides describing it cannot even agree on the basic facts. On one side, President Trump told reporters in the Oval Office this week that the United States controls the strait completely. He called the American naval blockade on Iranian shipping a steel wall and described it as infallible. He also admitted, almost in the same breath, that Iran can make trouble, that Iranian forces will, in his words, occasionally drop a mine, and the U.S. Navy finds it. That is not the language of total control. That is the language of a standoff being managed, not a war being won. On the other side, Iran's government says the blockade cannot be lifted through diplomacy at all. Just one day before Trump's comments, Iranian officials stated flatly that as long as the American blockade continues, the strait will not reopen, full stop. This is the same message Iran's outgoing national security chief delivered when he published a formal list of conditions: lift the U.S. naval blockade, withdraw American forces from the region, permanently end the war, cancel sanctions, release frozen Iranian assets, and pay compensation for war damage. Read that list again. That is not a negotiating position. That is, in substance, a demand for American capitulation dressed up in the language of a ceasefire memo. To understand how we got here, we have to go back to February of this year, when the war itself began. American and Israeli strikes hit Iranian military and government targets, and in the opening days of that campaign, Iran's supreme leader at the time, Ali Khamenei, was killed. That is one of the most consequential facts of this entire conflict, and it is still shaping everything happening in Tehran today. Khamenei's successor is his own relative, Mojtaba Khamenei, who has kept an unusually low public profile since taking the position. State media has released short, undated videos of him, but there has been no extended public appearance, no detailed accounting of his health or his day-to-day command of the country. When the man at the top of a security state is rarely seen and instructions travel mostly through written decrees, it creates room for other power centers, generals, Security Council officials, hardline factions to interpret what the leadership wants and act on that interpretation. That is not speculation. That is simply how authoritarian succession crises tend to function, and it is worth keeping in mind for everything that follows. In April, after an earlier ceasefire attempt collapsed, the United States imposed a naval blockade on Iranian ports, blocking vessels from entering or leaving. In June, Presidents Trump and Pezeshkian actually signed a memorandum of understanding. The U.S. would lift its blockade, and Iran would guarantee safe passage through the strait for 60 days, free of charge, while a longer-term arrangement was worked out with Oman and other Gulf states. For a moment, it looked like a genuine off-ramp. It didn't hold. By early August, following renewed attacks on commercial vessels and pressure campaigns against Arab states that Iran accused of siding with Washington, the United States reimposed the blockade. And that is the situation today, a blockade that was lifted once under a signed agreement and is now back, with Iran blaming Washington for bad faith and Washington blaming Iran for using the reopened waterway to keep attacking ships. Whichever version you believe, the practical result is the same. Normal commercial shipping through one of the most important choke points on Earth is, once again, not normal. Here's the analysis worth sitting with for a second. This blockade and reopen cycle is not a bug in the negotiation. It may be the negotiation. Iran gets to use the threat of closure as leverage without absorbing the full economic and military cost of a permanent closure. The U.S. gets to claim it controls the strait while quietly admitting mines still get planted. Neither side has an incentive to end the ambiguity, because the ambiguity itself is the tool each side is using on the other. That is a very different picture from a simple story of Iran versus America. It is closer to two exhausted boxers, both still swinging, both claiming they're winning, while the referee, global oil markets, absorbs every punch. And Iran, notably, has not stopped trying to reshape the rules of the strait even while these talks continue. Iran's parliament has been reviewing legislation that would formally ban vessels linked to the United States and Israel from transiting Hormuz altogether until Tehran receives compensation for war damage, while charging other nations a toll to pass through peacefully. Think about what that means if it becomes policy. Iran wouldn't be closing the strait to everyone. It would be turning itself into a toll booth operator on one of the world's most important trade routes, extracting payment from the rest of the world while continuing its standoff with Washington specifically. That is a much more sophisticated form of leverage than simply shutting the door. Now to the economic picture, because this is where the war stops being an abstract political dispute and becomes something measurable. The International Monetary Fund's own projections, published this year, estimate that Iran's economy will contract by roughly 6% in 2026, with inflation running close to 69%. Those are IMF numbers, not talking points from either side. Independent reporting has also pointed to major job losses inside Iran over the course of the war, and to a currency that has lost a significant share of its value. Satellite-based reporting has additionally indicated that tanker loading at Iran's main oil export terminal, Karg Island, the facility that historically handles the overwhelming majority of the country's crude exports, has at times slowed to a near standstill. When the export terminal that keeps the lights on for your national budget stops loading ships, that is not a rhetorical crisis, that is a fiscal one. This is precisely why President Trump has leaned so heavily on economic pressure as his primary lever, rather than committing to another major round of strikes. Betting that a government under this kind of fiscal strain will eventually be forced to the table is, on paper, a reasonable strategy. But it carries a real risk, and it's worth stating plainly. Economic pain doesn't automatically produce moderation. Sometimes it produces the opposite. A government backed into a corner can just as easily double down, hand more authority to its most hardline security institutions, and use nationalist grievance to explain away the suffering. Which brings us to the second major story of this week, because that appears to be exactly what is happening inside Iran's own halls of power. On Sunday, Iran replaced the man overseeing its most important security body. Mohammad Bagher Zolgadar, who had served as Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council since March, was moved into a quieter role as political advisor to the Supreme Leader. In his place, Mohsen Rezaei, a 71-year-old veteran who commanded the Revolutionary Guards during the entire Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, and has remained one of the most recognizable hardline figures in Iranian politics ever since. He also holds a doctorate in economics and served as a vice president under former President Raisi. So this is not simply a battlefield commander being installed. This is someone who understands both the military file and the economic one, being placed at the exact junction where Iran's security policy, its foreign policy, and its negotiating posture all intersect. Regional analysts have been direct about what this appointment signals. One senior Iran analyst put it bluntly: those inside the Iranian system who actually want to make a deal with Washington are not the ones currently in positions of power. Rezaei is widely described as a committed, disciplined figure, not necessarily someone pushing a new direction, but someone positioned to make sure the leadership's existing hardline position gets carried out consistently without the internal drift or mixed signals that plagued his predecessor's tenure. It's also worth noting who wasn't touched in this reshuffle. Iran's foreign ministry and its actual negotiating track with the U.S. and Oman remain formally intact. What changed is who enforces the line once it's drawn. That distinction matters. This wasn't a purge of diplomacy. It was a tightening of internal discipline around the diplomacy Iran has already chosen to pursue. Leverage first, concessions only if forced. That is also worth connecting back to the succession question we raised earlier. With a supreme leader who is rarely seen in public and governs largely through decree, the officials who control the machinery underneath him gain outsized influence over what the supreme leader's position actually means in practice day to day. Rezaei's appointment came with a formal decree naming him as the supreme leader's own representative on the Security Council, placing him, structurally, closer to the center of power than almost anyone else currently in the Iran-Clear government. If you want a single appointment that tells you where the real center of gravity in Tehran sits right now, this is probably it. Now let's step outside Iran entirely, because the most structurally significant development of the past week didn't happen in Tehran at all. It happened in Mecca. On August 7th, the leaders of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan signed what is now being called the Mecca Joint Defense Agreement, a mutual defense pact stating that an armed attack on any one of the three countries will be treated as an attack on all three. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Turkish President Erdogan, and Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif signed it in person, and analysts across the region have described it, without much hesitation, as a genuine turning point in Middle Eastern security architecture. It builds directly on a bilateral defense agreement Saudi Arabia and Pakistan had already signed roughly a year earlier. This new version simply widens the circle and formalizes it further. Turkish officials have been careful, publicly, to insist that the pact is not aimed at Iran specifically. Turkey's foreign minister said explicitly that no country was named as a common threat in the written agreement, and that the goal is to expand the circle further. He named Egypt directly as a country Ankara hopes will eventually join, describing it as a natural partner. As of this week, Egypt has not formally signed on. Cairo has participated in a series of four-nation security meetings with Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan over recent months. But analysts say Egyptian officials appear wary of the binding military obligations a formal treaty like this would create, particularly given Egypt's existing peace treaty commitments and its historically complicated relationship with Ankara over issues like Libya and the Eastern Mediterranean. Here's the part that deserves real scrutiny rather than just repeating the headline. Turkish officials have compared this pact's mutual defense clause to NATO's Article 5. That comparison is doing a lot of work, and it's worth being skeptical of it. NATO isn't just a piece of paper that says an attack on one is an attack on all. It's decades of integrated military planning, shared command structures, joint exercises, interoperable weapons systems, and a machinery for actually moving forces across borders under a unified command in a crisis. None of that exists yet between Riyadh, Ankara, and Islamabad. What exists is a political commitment on paper signed by three governments whose national interests do not always line up as neatly as the photo op suggested. Pakistan has to think carefully about India, a country it cannot afford to alienate through reckless entanglement in Gulf security disputes. Saudi Arabia sells enormous volumes of oil to India as well and has zero interest in importing a Pakistan-India rivalry into its own economic relationships. If Egypt eventually joins, it brings the Suez Canal and one of the region's largest militaries to the table, but also years of friction with Turkey over Libya and the Muslim Brotherhood that don't simply disappear because everyone signed the same document in the same room. So what does this pact actually accomplish right now, even without the full NATO-style machinery behind it? It accomplishes something that matters just as much in geopolitics as hardware. It signals that Gulf states are actively hedging against total dependence on the United States. The core lesson several regional governments appear to have drawn from this entire war, and honestly, this is the most important underlying theme running through the whole story, is not that American power is irrelevant. It's that American support doesn't always arrive in the form, on the timeline, or at the scale that Gulf partners actually need. That is a lesson learned the hard way, watching a superpower manage its own blockade with admitted gaps rather than closing them entirely. When your primary security guarantor tells the press it controls a waterway 100%, while also admitting the other side can still plant mines in it, hedging your bets with regional neighbors starts to look less like disloyalty to Washington and more like basic risk management. And that has consequences well beyond Iran. A Saudi Arabia with more security options of its own may feel less pressure to build its entire long-term security strategy around normalization with Israel and guarantees from Washington specifically. That doesn't necessarily kill the prospect of normalization outright, but it does change the bargaining environment considerably, and it's a dynamic worth watching closely in the months ahead because it touches everything from trade corridor plans linking India, the Gulf, and Europe to the broader question of who actually anchors security in this region for the next decade. Meanwhile, tensions in the Red Sea corridor remain active as well. Houthi forces and Saudi-backed Yemeni government forces have continued exchanging fire in recent weeks, with a ceasefire that had held since 2022 now under real strain since late July. Reports describe a blockade the Houthis announced against Saudi oil vessels following Saudi strikes on the airport in Sana'a, a cycle of retaliation that has already pulled in attacks on commercial shipping in an already tense waterway. This is a separate conflict from the Hormuz standoff, but it is happening in the same neighborhood at the same time, and it adds yet another variable to an already crowded regional security picture that the new Mecca Pact will eventually have to prove it can actually handle, not just describe on paper. So where does that leave us? Let's pull the threads together, because this is where the paradox we opened with really comes into focus. Washington says it has total control of the world's most important oil choke point while quietly managing an active mine threat inside it. Iran says it won't reopen that choke point without American surrender, while its own economy contracts by more than 6% and its currency keeps sliding. Tehran just handed its security file to one of the most hardline, disciplined figures in its modern political history, not necessarily to change course, but to make absolutely sure the current course doesn't waver. And three of the region's most significant military and economic powers just told the world in writing that they're no longer willing to bet everything on any single outside guarantor. None of these stories are actually separate. They are four pressure points on the exact same regional system, all tightening at once. And the honest, sober answer to what happens next is nobody fully controls this outcome. Not Washington, not Tehran, not Riyadh, and not Ankara. Every actor in this story is currently betting that pressure, patience, or new alliances will force the other side to move first. History suggests that when four major powers are all making that same bet simultaneously, at least one of them is going to be proven wrong. And we are watching in real time to see which one it is. That's where we'll leave today's breakdown. If you want the ground-level view of what's happening at the Lebanon front and inside Gaza this week, that's a separate story we'll be covering soon. This region rarely gives you just one crisis to track at a time.